Breaking this morning, Keir Starmer stood at the dispatch box and delivered the words no one saw coming: an unholy alliance of austerity and failure. He wasn't talking about the past. He was talking about the future. A future where Nigel Farage and the Conservative Party, two forces that have spent years circling each other like wary wolves, could finally merge into one. The chamber fell silent. Then it erupted, somewhere in the gallery. A journalist's pen froze mid-sentence. On the green benches below, faces turned pale. Outside, the grey London sky seemed to darken just a little more. This wasn't a rumour. This wasn't speculation. This was a Prime Minister, standing in the heart of British democracy, declaring war on a political earthquake that could reshape the nation forever. The leak had come hours earlier, buried on the front page of the Financial Times. Farage, behind closed doors, had told his wealthiest donors the unthinkable. A deal with the Tories was inevitable. A merger, a pact, an alliance that could put him one step closer to Downing Street. By the time Starmer rose to speak at Prime Minister's questions, the story had already begun to burn. And if you want the full timeline of what happened next, the chaos, the denials, the fury, hit subscribe now. Because what unfolded in the next 47 minutes would send shockwaves through Westminster that are still echoing tonight. At 12:03 p.m, the Speaker called the House to order, and the firestorm began. To understand what happened in Parliament today, you have to go back. Not weeks, not months, years, because this story, this collision of ambition, ideology, and power has been building since the moment Britain voted to leave the European Union in 2016. Nigel Farage has never been a man content to watch from the sidelines. He was the architect of Brexit, the voice that turned a fringe idea into a national mandate. But when the dust settled and the Conservatives claimed victory, Farage was left on the outside. No cabinet position, no seat at the table, just a microphone and a promise that one day he'd be back. He kept that promise. In 2021, he rebranded the Brexit Party into Reform UK, a harder edge, a sharper message. And slowly, quietly, the numbers began to rise. Former Tory voters, disillusioned, angry, exhausted by years of scandal and stagnation, started to drift. Not to Labour, not to the Lib Dems, to Farage. By the time the 2024 general election arrived, Reform UK had become something the establishment could no longer ignore. They won 5 seats, 5 voices in Parliament. And in dozens of constituencies, they split the Conservative vote so cleanly that Labour swept through like a flood. Keir Starmer won a landslide. Not because Britain loved Labour, but because the right had torn itself in two. The Conservatives were left shattered. Kemi Badenoch, the new leader, inherited a party in crisis. Membership hemorrhaging, donors nervous. And every week, it seemed, another former Tory MP announced they were crossing the floor to reform. 3 more went this week alone. And then came the leak. Yesterday evening, the Financial Times published a bombshell. Nigel Farage, speaking privately to a room full of Reform's wealthiest backers, had said something no one was supposed to hear. He told them a deal with the Conservatives wasn't just possible, it was inevitable. Whether it would be a full merger or an electoral pact, candidates standing aside in key seats to avoid splitting the vote, he didn't say. But the message was clear. Farage believed the two parties would unite. And when they did, they'd be unstoppable. The report was explosive. Both Badenoch and Farage had publicly ruled out any alliance. For months, they'd insisted they were rivals, not allies. Enemies, not partners. And yet here was Farage, in private, painting a very different picture. This wasn't just political gossip. This was a roadmap, a strategy, a confession. And Keir Starmer had clearly been waiting for the moment to strike, because by the time Parliament convened this afternoon, Labour's attack lines were already written. Their research teams had been working through the night, pulling up old quotes, compiling voting records, building a narrative. And that narrative was simple. The Tories and Reform weren't just similar. They were the same. Two faces of the same failed ideology: austerity, division, chaos. An unholy alliance. But this was no ordinary political skirmish. The stakes were existential. If Farage and Badenoch truly did unite their forces, Labour's majority, however large it looked on paper, could evaporate by the next election. Polling already showed Reform surging in the red wall. The Tories were clawing back support in the home counties. Together, they could create a right-wing juggernaut that would make Starmer's government look like a brief interruption in Conservative rule. That's why today mattered. That's why the Prime Minister didn't hold back. As MPs filed into the chamber, The air felt different, tighter, sharper. There were no friendly nods across the aisle today. No jokes whispered behind hands. Just silence and tension. George Freeman, a conservative backbencher, rose first. He'd been the victim of a deepfake video AI-generated footage claiming he'd defected to Reform. He wanted to talk about digital threats to democracy, about the dangers of misinformation, but Starmer wasn't interested in hypotheticals. He saw the opening, and he took it. The moment Starmer opened his mouth, the temperature in the chamber shifted. "I thank the honorable member for raising that," he began, his tone measured, deliberate. "And it is an important issue. We do need to work cross-party on deepfakes, on AI, and other issues that need to be addressed." A pause, just long enough for the room to think he was being reasonable. Then the blade came out. "I have to say, I missed his alleged defection to Reform. I wouldn't believe it if I had seen it." A ripple of nervous laughter from the Labour benches. The Conservatives stayed silent, sensing what was coming. "But I have to say there's a lot of them going. 3 ex-colleagues have gone, I think, this week." The laughter grew louder. Badenoch's face remained stone. Across the aisle, Reform's 5 MPs sat motionless, watching. "They talk about leaks," Starmer continued, his voice rising now, sharper. "That's where their leaks are going. To Reform." The Labour benches erupted. Cheers, desk thumping, the kind of noise that echoes through the old stone walls and tells you something has landed. But Starmer wasn't done. "And I saw a leak talking of leaks on the front page of the Financial Times this morning." The room went quiet again. Every eye locked on him, apparently. "The leader of Reform says he wants to merge with the party opposite and sit down here with them." He gestured toward the Conservative benches. "An absolutely unholy alliance of austerity and failure. Chaos." The Labour side exploded. MPs on their feet roaring approval. Opposition benches shouting back, some in fury, some in denial. The Speaker's voice barely audible over the din, calling for order. His gavel slamming down like a judge at a trial spinning out of control. Kemi Badenoch sat frozen, her jaw tight, her hands gripping the edge of the bench. Beside her, shadow ministers looked at each other, unsure whether to respond, unsure what to say. Because the truth was no one had a good answer. The FT story was out there. Farage had said it, and now Starmer had weaponized it outside the chamber. The reaction was instant. Political journalists, already camped in the press gallery, began typing furiously. Within seconds, the first tweets went live. Breaking. Starmer calls potential Tory reform pact an unholy alliance of austerity and failure. PM goes on the attack over FT. Leak accuses Farage and Badenoch of secret backroom deal. Labour seizes on reform merger reports, warns of far-right takeover of Conservative Party. The hashtag spread like wildfire. Hashtag PMQs. Hashtag unholy alliance. Hashtag Farage and Badenoch. Within minutes, clips of Starmer's remarks were circulating on X, TikTok, Instagram, replayed, remixed, memed. The video of him saying unholy alliance was already racking up hundreds of thousands of views, but it wasn't just online. Across Britain, in homes, offices, pubs, people were watching. Lunch breaks interrupted by news alerts. Phones buzzing with push notifications. BBC, Sky News, ITV, every channel cut to live coverage. In Clacton, Farage's seaside constituency, a small crowd had gathered outside his constituency office. Some were supporters, holding Reform UK placards, insisting this was all a media stitch-up. Others were locals, curious, worried, demanding answers. Is it true? One woman shouted at a passing aide. Is he really going to team up with them? No response. Just hurried footsteps and a slammed door. In Westminster, the Liberal Democrats smelled blood. Within an hour of PMQs ending, their press office released a statement. Sharp, unforgiving. The Tories are so desperate they would happily do a deal to put Nigel Farage in number 10. It's why so many former lifelong Conservative voters are turning to the Liberal Democrats as the only party that will defend traditional British values of decency, tolerance, and the rule of law. It was a pitch, a plea, and a warning, because if a Tory reform alliance did materialize, the centre ground of British politics would vanish overnight. Labour would be the only left-of-centre option. The Lib Dems would be squeezed, and the battle for Britain's future would become a binary choice: Starmer's progressives versus Farage's populists. No middle ground. No compromise. Just war. Back in Parliament, The questions kept coming. Labour MPs stood one after another, each asking Starmer to condemn the potential pact, each giving him another opportunity to hammer the message home. Does the Prime Minister agree that a deal between Reform and the Conservatives would represent a betrayal of moderate voters? Yes. Does he believe this so-called alliance would drag Britain backwards? Absolutely. Would it threaten the values of tolerance and decency this country was built on? Without question. It was a coordinated assault. Rehearsed, relentless, ruthless. And with every answer, Starmer twisted the knife a little deeper. On social media, Reform UK's official account tried to push back. A thread, a denial, a counter-narrative. The mainstream media is lying again. Nigel Farage has been clear. Reform UK stands alone. We are not the Tories. We will never be the Tories. This is a desperate smear by a failing Labour government. But the thread was drowned out, ratioed, mocked, because the Financial Times wasn't a tabloid. It wasn't a clickbait blog. It was one of the most respected newspapers in the world. And their sources were Reform donors. People who'd been in the room. People who'd heard Farage speak. You couldn't deepfake that. By mid-afternoon, senior Conservatives were being dragged in front of cameras. Robert Jenrick, Shadow Justice Secretary, tried to shut it down. There will be no deal, he said, his voice firm but strained. Kemi Badenoch has made that clear. Nigel Farage has made that clear. Both leaders are opposed. This is Labour trying to distract from their failing budget, but the cracks were showing. Because journalists kept asking the same question, over and over. If both leaders are opposed, why did Farage tell donors it was inevitable? Jenrick didn't have an answer. Just repetition, denial, deflection, and the public wasn't buying it. Phone-ins on LBC, Times Radio, BBC 5 Live flooded with calls. Angry Tory voters, concerned Reform supporters, moderates terrified of what a merger would mean. I voted Conservative my whole life, one caller said, her voice shaking. But if they get into bed with Farage, I'm done. I can't support that. Another, a Reform voter from Yorkshire. I didn't vote for Nigel to sell out to the Tories. If this happens, I'll feel betrayed. The coalition Farage had been trying to build working-class ex-Labour voters and disillusioned Tories was already beginning to fracture. Because the two groups didn't trust each other. And they sure as hell didn't trust a backroom deal stitched together by elites behind closed doors. PM. Downing Street had scheduled a press briefing. Starmer's official spokesman faced a room packed with reporters, cameras, microphones. Does the Prime Minister believe Nigel Farage is a liar? The Prime Minister has been clear about what was reported in the Financial Times. But does he think Farage lied to donors? Or is he lying now? I'm not going to speculate on Mr. Farage's honesty. What I will say is that the British people deserve transparency. And right now, they're not getting it. The questions kept coming. Relentless, probing. And with every non-answer, the story grew bigger, because this wasn't just about a potential pact anymore. It was about trust, about honesty, about whether the people leading Britain's opposition could be believed. And as the sun began to set over Westminster, one thing was clear. The storm wasn't over. It was just beginning. By PM, Nigel Farage had had enough. He'd spend the afternoon dodging calls, ignoring texts, watching his phone light up with notifications he refused to read. His media team had been in crisis mode since the Financial Times story dropped. Damage control, spin, denial. But none of it was working. The narrative had escaped them. And so, at 6:17 p.m., Farage did what he always does when cornered. He went live, not on the BBC, not on ITV, on GB News, his home turf, his audience, his rules. The camera clicked on. Farage sat in his Westminster office, the Houses of Parliament visible through the window behind him. His expression was calm, too calm, the kind of calm that comes right before a storm. Good evening, he began, his voice steady, measured. I want to address the absolute nonsense that's been circulating today. He leaned forward, his eyes locked on the lens. The Financial Times published a story this morning claiming I told donors that a deal with the Conservative Party was inevitable. Let me be absolutely clear, that is not what I said. And it is certainly not what I believe. A pause. Just long enough to let the denial sink in. Yes, I spoke to donors. Yes, we discussed the political landscape. But what I actually said was that if, and this is a big if the Conservative Party were to fundamentally change, if they were to adopt real conservative principles, then perhaps one day there could be a conversation. His tone sharpened. But as they are right now, absolutely not. A deal with the current Conservative Party would cost us votes. It would betray everything Reform UK stands for. And I will not allow that to happen. It was a masterclass in evasion. He hadn't denied speaking to donors. He hadn't denied discussing a potential alliance. He just reframed it. Conditional, hypothetical, distant. But the damage was done. Within minutes, clips of the interview were spreading, and alongside them, side-by-side comparisons. What the Financial Times reported, what Farage was now claiming. The discrepancies glaring, political. Analysts were already tearing it apart. He's trying to have it both ways, one commentator said on Sky News. He wants to keep his donors happy by suggesting a deal is possible, but he also wants to keep his voters by pretending it's not. The man's playing both sides. Back in Parliament, Labour MPs were watching and grinning because Farage had just given them exactly what they needed. Not a clean denial, not a firm rejection, but ambiguity, doubt. A door left slightly ajar, and Keir Starmer's team was ready to kick it wide open. At 7:03 p.m. Labour's official Twitter account posted a video, 30 seconds long. It opened with footage of Farage from earlier that evening. A deal with the current Conservative Party would cost us votes. Then a cut. Archive footage from 2019. Farage standing beside Boris Johnson, grinning, shaking hands. The Brexit Party standing down candidates to help the Tories win. Then another cut. 2024. 3 former Conservative MPs faces the public recognized announcing their defections to Reform. One after another, like dominoes. Then a final cut. Back to today. Starmer at the dispatch box, an unholy alliance of austerity and failure. The video ended with text on screen. They've done it before. They'll do it again. Don't let them fool you. Within an hour, it had 500,000 views. The Conservative Party was in freefall. At 7:45 p.m. Kemi Badenoch finally broke her silence. A hastily arranged interview on BBC News. She looked exhausted, frustrated, cornered. "Let me be very clear," she said, her voice tight. "There will be no pact with Reform UK. Not now. Not ever. I have said this repeatedly. Nigel Farage has said it. I don't know how many more times we need to say it before people believe us." The interviewer pressed, but the Financial Times spoke to multiple donors who were in the room. "Are they all lying?" Badenoch's jaw clenched. "I can't speak to what Nigel Farage said in private. I can only speak for the Conservative Party. And I am telling you there will be no deal. But if he approached you, he hasn't. But if he did, he won't. It was a car crash. Defensive. Evasive. And it made her look weak, because the question wasn't just about whether a deal existed now. It was about whether one could exist in the future. And Badenoch couldn't bring herself to rule it out completely. Because the truth was, she couldn't afford to. The Conservative Party was hemorrhaging support. Polling showed them neck and neck with Reform in some regions. If she alienated Farage completely, if she burned that bridge forever, she risked splitting the right-wing vote permanently. But if she left the door open, even a crack, she looked like a coward, a sellout. She was trapped, and Starmer knew it. At 8:30 p.m. Downing Street released a statement. Short, brutal, perfectly timed. Today, the Prime Minister warned that a Tory-Reform pact would represent an alliance of austerity and failure. Tonight, neither party has been able to categorically rule it out. The British people deserve better than backroom deals and political games. They deserve honesty. And they deserve a government that works for them, not for itself. It was a kill shot. BYPM. The evening news broadcasts were leading with it. Not the budget. Not the NHS. Not international affairs. Just this. The chaos. The accusations. The denials that didn't quite deny. ITV News. Starmer accuses Farage and Badenoch of secret pact. Both leaders scramble to respond. BBC News at 10. Political earthquake as PM warns of unholy alliance between Tories and Reform. Channel 4 News. Is Britain's right wing on the verge of a merger or a meltdown? In living rooms across the country, people watched. Some angry, some confused, some afraid. Because this wasn't just Westminster theatre. This was about the future. About what kind of country Britain would become. And nobody knew the answer anymore. On social media, the battle raged. Hashtags trending. Arguments erupting. Friendships fracturing over retweets and reply threads. Stand with Starmer. Hashtag Reform UK strong. Hashtag Tories out. Hashtag no to Farage. Everyone had an opinion. Everyone had a side. But buried beneath the noise, beneath the fury and the theatre, there was something else. Something quieter. Something more dangerous. Uncertainty. Because for the first time in years, Nobody knew what came next. Would Farage and Badenoch actually do a deal? Would Reform absorb the Conservatives? Would the Tories collapse entirely? Or would this all blow over by morning? Just another Westminster storm that raged for a day and vanished by the weekend? Nobody knew. And that terrified people more than anything else. At 10:47 p.m., Nigel Farage posted one final tweet. The establishment is panicking. Labour knows we're coming for them. The Tories know their time is over. And the media knows they can't stop us. This is just the beginning. No denial, no clarification, just defiance. And in that moment, watching his words appear on screen, millions of people realized something. This wasn't ending tonight. This was only just beginning. By midnight, the lights in Westminster had dimmed, the journalists had filed their final reports. The cameras had been switched off. The MPs had retreated to their offices, their homes, their hotel rooms, each one carrying the weight of a day that had changed everything and nothing all at once. But the silence felt wrong, because across Britain, people were still awake, still scrolling, still trying to make sense of what they'd witnessed. In a terrace house in Stoke-on-Trent, a man in his 50s sat at his kitchen table, a cold cup of tea in front of him. He'd voted Conservative his entire life. His father had. His grandfather had. It was tradition, loyalty, identity. But tonight, he wasn't sure anymore. If they team up with Farage, he muttered to his wife, "I don't know what I'll do." She didn't answer. She didn't know either. In a flat in Hackney, a university student watched clips of PMQs on her phone for the third time. She'd never voted Conservative. Never would. But something about today unsettled her. Because if the right really did unite, if Farage and Badenoch buried their differences and became one force, what chance did her side have? Labour's majority looked solid now. But majorities had crumbled before. In a pub in Clacton, a small group of Reform supporters gathered around the table, pints half empty, voices low. They were angry. Not at Starmer, not at the media, at Farage. "He told us he'd never sell out," one said, his voice bitter. "He told us Reform was different." "Maybe he's not selling out," another replied. "Maybe he's just being smart. You can't win alone." "Then what's the point?" the first man shot back. "If we're just the Tories under a different name, what's the bloody point?" Nobody answered, because nobody knew. And that was the strange thing about tonight. For all the noise, all the fury, all the accusations and denials, nothing had actually been resolved. Farage hadn't confirmed a deal, but he hadn't ruled it out either. Badenoch had denied everything. But her denials felt hollow, desperate. Starmer had landed his blows. But the fight was far from over. And so Britain went to bed uncertain. Uncertain about the future. Uncertain about the opposition. Uncertain about whether democracy itself was bending under the weight of ambition and calculation. Because that's what tonight had revealed. More than anything else, politics wasn't about principles anymore. It wasn't about policies or manifestos or vision. It was about survival. About numbers. About who could cut the best deal, form the strongest coalition, seize power and hold it at any cost. And maybe it had always been that way. Maybe the mask had just slipped a little further tonight. In Downing Street, Keir Starmer sat alone in his office. No aides, no advisors. Just him and the weight of the day. He'd won today. He knew that. His attack had landed. The Tories and Reform were on the back foot, scrambling, contradicting each other. Labour had controlled the narrative. But he also knew this wasn't over. Because Farage was right about one thing. They were coming for him. Whether it was together or apart. Whether it was a pact or a war between them. The right wing of British politics was rebuilding. Slowly, quietly. And sooner or later, they'd be ready. The next election felt far away. But it wasn't. Not really. A few years. Maybe less if something went wrong. And when it came, Starmer would need more than clever lines and coordinated attacks. He'd need a country that still believed in him, and right now, he wasn't sure if that country existed. Across the river, in a Reform UK office, a young staffer sat staring at a spreadsheet. Donor contacts, membership numbers, polling data from key constituencies. The numbers looked good. Better than good. Reform was rising. And if they kept rising, if they kept peeling away Tory voters and disaffected Labour ones, they wouldn't need a deal with anyone. They could win on their own. But the staffer also knew what the spreadsheet didn't show. The fragility, the volatility, the fact that Reform support was a mile wide and an inch deep. Built on anger, not loyalty. And anger fades, unless you feed it. And tonight had been a feast. Somewhere in the Conservative Party headquarters, a strategy meeting was wrapping up. It had gone on for hours. Voices raised, tempers flared, because nobody could agree on what to do next. Some wanted to attack Farage, call him a liar, distance themselves completely. Others wanted to reach out quietly, keep the door open, because if reform kept growing, the Tories would need them, and a brave few suggested something else entirely. Forget reform, forget Farage, rebuild the Conservative Party from scratch, become something new, something better. But nobody listened to them, because rebuilding takes time, and time was the one thing they didn't have. The meeting ended with no decision, no plan, just exhaustion. And outside in the cold December air, Britain slept uneasily, because tonight had proven something nobody wanted to admit. The old rules were gone, the gentlemen's agreements, the unspoken boundaries, the idea that some things just weren't done in British politics, all of it shattered. What came next was anyone's guess. Would Farage and Badenoch shake hands in 6 months and announce a grand alliance? Would reform splinter under the weight of its own contradictions? Would the Conservatives collapse entirely, becoming a footnote in history books studied by children who'd never known a Tory government? Or would something else happen? Something nobody had predicted. Something that would make today's chaos look quaint by comparison. Nobody knew. But as the clock struck 1 in the morning, as the streetlights flickered over empty roads and silent squares, one thing was certain. Today wasn't the end of a story. It was the beginning of one. And history would remember what happened next, because the fight for Britain's soul had begun. And there was no turning back now.